You are listening to the extreme metal podcast Necropolis, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. Welcome to Necropolis. I am Jason, also known as Lone Goat from Goatcraft, and this is the first episode since I've been back from Europe. Had a great time with Mr. Shelly from Hate Meditations, the co-host of this podcast, and he did have to take a day off from hanging out with me because we drank too much in New York. I was drinking mead and all that, and we had a great time, but probably pushed the alcohol a little too much for our British friend. And so we are going to be discussing a pretty light topic today, just how we discovered metal, how we got into it, what metal means to us on a personal level. Like, is it just a hobby or something more? Is it something that is greatly profound to our subjective experiences, and as well as how our tastes in metal have evolved over time. So I do not want to mediate this episode too much. I would rather have it like an open forum, but I would like everyone to, contribute to the episode and chime in whenever they feel like it, but also allow people to express their thoughts. So we do have Shelly, who survived drinking with me. Shelly is from the website Hate Meditations, Metal Legion magazine. So thank you for coming back. I didn't scare you off when I was in England.
No, not quite. But yeah, it was awesome to see you. I'm only a little guy, so I can't quite keep up with the boozing. But yeah, we had a great time, and it's good to be back.
Yes, sir. And our other guest today, we have Brett Claren from Journey into Darkness and Sorrow. Brett was also on this podcast at one point for his episode, and we discussed physics quite a bit, which you don't have happen every day unless you're into physics. So I want to thank Brett for coming back.
Thank you for having me again.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I do have a great friend of mine, Daniel Valdez. He was from the project called Gored, which a lot of people in Texas know of that project, as well as he's still jamming with some other musicians, but they haven't really released anything. But I know real life happens, and he has children. He teaches high school. So Daniel I've known since I was 18, and like he's seen the best and the worst of Jason. So I want to thank Daniel for coming on the program today.
All right, thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. We also have another personal friend of mine, Jaime. He also goes by the name of Metal Jaime. He's a veteran of the Texas scene. A lot of people know who this guy is. He's always at the best shows. He's always brushing shoulders with people, and is a very talkative and very insightful guy. He was part of the street team for Relapse, Nuclear Blast, Century Media, et cetera, as well as he has been slightly, involved on the music side. Like I do believe he did vocals for Thornspawn for a show or two. But other than that, I don't think he was in any big bands. But he's just a great character, and everyone in especially San Antonio knows who Jaime is. So, Jaime, I want to thank you for being a guest again on this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me again, Jason. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, just to kind of start this episode today, I'll start off, and we'll have kind of an open forum. So, I got into metal. I would say about the age of 10, got into Metallica, and I remember having friends that, they wanted to hear heavier music too. I'd put on Metallica and they would headbang and be really awkward, kids, just like, I even remember I went to one private school, and there was really well-off kids, with rich parents and all that. And one kid told me to bring a Metallica CD over to his house, and me being just a dumb kid, I just picked Load. And, so I put on Load, and that kid was just headbanging all over the place to Load. Like, hindsight is like, if I should have taken a video of that and just posted it on the internet and have like 100,000 likes on it, just this kid going crazy over Load, which, yeah, it's stupid kid stuff. But yeah, eventually I wanted something heavier, and I got into the classics like Exodus, Slayer, Megadeth, blah 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 blah. But it wasn't until I met Alan Moses, who was part of, he actually ran the Covenant of Death fan club for Morbid Angel. He worked at a private school as the maintenance man, and he brought in Morbid Angel CDs and wrote me a 2-page list of albums to buy. So this is before I had the internet and all that. And And I would actually go down to Aces Records in Tampa, which was, there's videos of Aces on YouTube of David Vincent working there and all that. But I loaded up on death metal CDs in Tampa. I moved to Texas when I was 13. And then I just had that list to go by, and eventually started buying a whole bunch of like Napalm Death, Carcass, Obituary, things of that nature. And after a couple years of that, I eventually had more access to the internet, and that was when the lid was blown off and everything was available. So I would say about the age of 16, I started getting into black metal, but it didn't really click until I was like 17 or 18. But yeah, that's how I got into metal. I was initially drawn to it because of the heaviness of it. And when you're a child, it's very personal too. It's like when you finally start getting into music where you enjoy it and it speaks to you, and just finding better and better things just means so much more to you on a personal level. And metal was definitely what I was obsessed with, extreme metal especially. And that's how I discovered it, and I was obsessed with it. I mean, I guess I still am by having a podcast. But so I'll start with Shelly, since he's the co-host. How did you get into metal as a kid?
Well, the interesting thing I find about this question is the two sort of key factors that influence what people will tell you about this. One is where they grew up, and one is when they grew up. So for me, I was a teenager in the early to mid 2000s. So I did have the internet, but it was very different to the internet that we have now, in that a lot of it was just obscure websites, obscure forums, MSN chat with friends and so on, which massively influenced how I got into metal. But also I grew up at a time when the biggest bands that all the kids were listening to were what is now known as new metal, which, however cringy and embarrassing we could look back at it now, it was the thing that got me into heavy music. And I'm not embarrassed to say that anymore, because, we were all young once and we all did stupid shit. But at the time, I'd never heard anything like it, and I just wanted heavier and heavier stuff. So I was reading a lot of Kerrang magazine, and they would sometimes feature, heavier artists on there. And from there, it wasn't, such a great leap to sort of get into bands like Arch Enemy, and then discover from there bands like Carcass and At the Gates. And, you just end up going down that rabbit hole. And I very, very quickly clicked with black metal. And it wasn't until much later, in, say, I was like 18, 19, that I went back and discovered, the classics in your Iron Maidens and your Slayers and so on. I was a very late comer to that kind of thing. But also on the location aspect, I grew up on a very rural, very quiet, sleepy part of the UK. There were only 3 other kids at school that were even remotely interested in music. None of them were interested in metal, but we all bonded because we all liked, quite weird and different music to what everyone else did. But it did feel like discovering some weird arcane knowledge that only you have access to and no one else really knows about. And it wasn't until I started going out in London or moved to Leeds and met other metalheads, I was like, oh, there's a whole massive community out there of people, and it's huge. And you start linking up with them and stuff. And that was something of a revelation for me as well, I would say.
Yeah, so in England, I met a couple of your friends in London. We went to see Emperor, and I remember just watching Emperor, and you were like having a spiritual experience. You're just really into it, and it was great to see your reaction. Like, I was just there, headbanging, and the pit next to us was pretty rowdy, so we're also being hit quite a bit. Like,
I was quite pissed by that point as well. But yeah, because Emperor were one of the first proper black metal bands I got into. I've seen them live a few times before, but each time it's been very, very special. And I just turn into a 14-year-old again. So,
yeah, I definitely saw that side of Shelley where he's not so reserved. He's really just like, spiritual experience, just having the time of his life. So, yeah, I guess I got to see the child Shelley there for a moment. So,
yeah, he is there, buried down.
So let's start with Brett. How about you? So, I think you're going to have a different experience
definitely.
with Shelley and I. So since you were in Sorrow, which was from 1991 or I think 89, correct?
Yeah, 89 to like 91, 92.
I see. So your entrance into metal is, even without the internet, it's all, word of mouth and flyers and tape trading, correct?
Yeah. It definitely is different than you guys. And it's actually different than a lot of other people, even my age. And I'm in my 50s, just so that people know. So I was growing up in the 80s, basically, when I guess the birth of, I'll just say, extreme metal to encompass all of it. So really, I kind of grew up during the start of it, which is a great experience. But I actually kind of can almost pinpoint the day that I got into metal. It really wasn't even a transition. I mean, it was like a 1 week transition. It wasn't like over a long period of time. I was really into hardcore at the time, like early 80s, mid 80s, a lot of early like Washington, D.C. bands, and some of the New York bands. But I was just really into hardcore California stuff like Black Flag, Minor Threat, Circle Jerks, Government Issue. And so I always liked the fast, heavy stuff. I was always into it. And I had a friend in high school, and his older brother was in a band called Phantom Tollbooth. And the guitarist of that band's name was Dave Rick. And he actually ended up in King Missile and a Bongwater and a couple other semi-famous bands. And I went over to Dave Rick's house one time with friends, and he just picked up Slayer Helloweights. It just came out. And he played one side of it, and it was kind of in the background. I was like, oh, this is interesting. But I always had an issue with metal, actually, because in the 80s, when I was listening to hardcore, lyrics were everything to me. I mean, the music was also important, but like I really get into lyrics. And hardcore lyrics were much more personal and in some ways political, and a lot of teenage angst in them. Where at the time, a lot of the metal was, fantasy and satanic. Now, I was always against religion. I despise religion. So the satanic part of it, I thought was kind of like silly, but at the same time, I started to realize, hey, wait a second, this is good because it's offensive and it bothers people, and it kind of rubs people the wrong way. So I had a problem with the lyrics. So I never really listened to any metal before then. And he put that album on. I was like, all right, it sounds okay. And like the next day or two, I forgot that within a week, we went to must have been Slip Disc, because on Long Island, Slip Disc was the place to get any metal and hardcore. And I remember buying that and taping it. And I went to work like that night. And I put Helloweights into my Walkman, the Sony Walkman, the original ones, but they were blue and metal. And anyway, I put that album on and I listened to it for 45 minutes. And when that album ended, it was an epiphany, like, to be cheesy. My life just changed. I was so blown away by that album that I spent probably almost the rest of my life at this point looking for albums that would give me that sense of excitement and feeling again. And so that was basically, that was it. That day I was into metal. So after that, then, I started buying Exodus, Possessed, I was buying Morbid Angel as for demos. It was before Altars of Madness, Rigor Mortis, Death, and then Immolation were in the area, Incantation, Primeval, all those bands, the New York bands. I just started getting heavily into that. And I still listen to hardcore after that, but it just developed much more into an obsession with metal and particularly death metal. And so I was into death metal for a very long time. And at first I really didn't like black metal. It was a little bit too sloppy for me, I guess would be the word. But then eventually when I started listening to Emperor and In the Night Side Eclipse came out, then that was another one of those albums in my life that like changed my life. And I was blown away by that album, and that's kind of got me into the whole black metal thing. So I guess that's my transition from hardcore into metal, into death metal and black metal. But I never, ever got into regular metal. I don't like Judas Priest. I don't like Iron Maiden. I just, any of those more traditional style heavy metal bands, I don't like, except for Black Sabbath, and only early Black Sabbath. I don't like later Black Sabbath. So there's my entrance.
What about Show No Mercy? Did you like that?
I liked Show No Mercy because some of that, you can hear some of the thrash in that, and you can hear some of the like the hardcore like with the fast thrash beats and stuff. So I was able to listen to that, but that definitely was the, I guess that would be the borderline for me. So anything that was more metal than that album, than Show No Mercy, I wouldn't listen to. And anything from Show No Mercy on, heavier, that's what I would listen to.
So Daniel's wife, she thought the song "Die by the Sword" was called "Dinosaur." And a segue there, Mr. Daniel. How about you? I remember we had a good laugh over that. It's like dinosaur, like you're listening to dinosaur metal.
We were all in the car, and she was like, "Why are they saying dinosaur? Dinosaur." That was funny. Well, growing up, my uncles were into like standard metal, and both of them were military armor and artillery, and they were into stuff like AC/DC and Iron Maiden, Judas Priest. So I got that from them. And then the neighborhood kids were a little bit older than me, and they were into the thrash scene. And I remember hearing Kill 'Em All for the first time. And once I heard that album, I just wanted more of it. And that began my search there. And where I grew up, they had three scenes: the punk scene, the death metal scene, and black metal scene. And they like to hate on each other, but at the same time, they would tape trade.
That was in Brownsville, correct? The border?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Brownsville, Texas.
Yeah, it's right next to the Mexican border. And so there's a lot of heavy Mexican culture there, and a lot of Mexican Americans. And, I met a couple of people from Brownsville, and they seem to, I don't know if it's I've never been there, but is it pretty rough there compared to like San Antonio and New Braunfels?
It can be. It just depends on whether you mind your business or not.
So, yeah, when I met you, I was 18, but I think you were like 25 or 24 around there. But I remember I would keep showing you all these new bands I was finding, and I guess you enjoyed the when I like music spammed you back then, and listen to this band, how about this band, and all that, and then at the end of when we hung out, I would always like, well, let's go to a corner store now so you can buy me some beer, because I was a minor. And so Brownsville, like they have the band Pantheon from there. You know them, right?
Yeah, and I growing up, we had a lot of parties that were out in fields or at someone's backyard, and Pantheon would be playing there, and I got to know them.
Very cool, very cool. So what I noticed with you, like you're, heavily into Morbid Angel, Death, et cetera, but you also like some of the bands you listen to influence like how you write music. Like even though Gored could be considered like a brutal death metal band, there's a lot of parallels to stuff like Angel Corpse I hear in the music. So like how would you view like how your taste evolved, like in terms of like what you listen to and what influenced like your musicianship?
Well, being in a brutal death band was also a decision made by the rest of the bandmates. So if the drummer was into that style, I would tailor my riff writing to that style of music. I could go for almost any, because I would play everything I get my hands on, from 70s acid rock to heavy metal, death metal, or black metal. So as a musician, I saw things from purely a music perspective. I would try to play everything, and going along with the drummer Chris, we decided to go for brutal death metal, so that's what we did.
I see. But yeah, I still definitely hear like a little Angel Corpse, little Deeds of Flesh, and all that in your musicianship and your writing. So cool. So got into metal in Brownsville, Texas, which is a border town. Did you ever hear about cartels? I know like El Paso might have some issues of cartels, but does Brownsville?
Oh, they definitely exist, and just choose to stay out of their way. And, like I said before, you mind your own business and you'll be fine.
All right, cool. How about you, Mr. Jaime? you've been into metal forever, and your nickname is Metal Jaime. So your name Metal. How'd you get into it?
Well, similar to Brett, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. Again, I'm from McAllen originally, which is about an hour away from Brownsville, border town, very small, kind of ruralish at the time. Right now it's huge, but at the time it was kind of small, a small little town. There weren't that many radio stations that played, some popular music, and the ones that did were mostly playing top 40 or hip hop R&B. So it's kind of hard to get a lot of music from, other avenues. And at the time I didn't really have much money. So I relied a lot on mixtapes and, word of mouth and stuff like that. One of my cousins, she's a little bit older than I, she was really into goth, and, she started playing, the song, the Cure, and, other goth bands. And that kind of started opening the door towards the metal side. And at the time, this was probably about 89 or 90, because I was about 10 years old. Her boyfriend played Cro-Mag's Age of Quarrel in his car stereo, and I was just completely blown away. I mean, it was just like, if somebody had been eating pizza forever and now you got a nice, filet mignon steak, and it's like, wow. So I started asking him and picking his brain, like, hey, what other bands? And he wrote down like a little list of paper, like, hey, here are the bands. Look them up, if you can, get some tapes from them, and you'll be, on your way. And again, I didn't have much money, so I relied on, and again, some of you older folks might remember, there used to be something called Columbia House and BMG, where for like a penny, you would get like 12 or 15 cassette tapes. So I basically started looking at their catalog, and out of the whole catalog, I maybe found like 2 cassettes from the list that my cousin's boyfriend gave me. And one of them was Megadeth, Rest in Peace, and the other one, oh man, I can't remember the name of the other one. I think it was Metallica, but I can't remember.
Must have been Metallica.
Yeah, it was, again, because those BMG catalogs, they didn't go deep into the underground. It was mostly, whatever's popular. So I started listening from there, and then what happened was I was also, I'm still a big horror movie fan, and back in those days, the USA Network would have Commander USA's Groovy Movies and Up All Night with Rhonda Shear and Gilbert Gottfried. So, I was up at those hours, channel surfing, watching those movies, and in between the commercials, I'd check other channels to see what else was on, and I bumped into Headbangers Ball. And to that, that opened up a whole Pandora's box for me to get more, insight into other bands. And then they even had a sub program from Headbangers Ball called Into the Pit, where they went more into the darker, more underground bands. So as you can imagine, being a 10, 11-year-old kid, getting all this, it was just like a brain overload. So pen and paper, I'm starting to write names of bands and songs and trying to keep up with it, so that hopefully I might run into somebody that might know these bands and can make me a mixtape. Fast forward a couple of years, and we decided to move to San Antonio. So now, it's the country mouse moving up to the big city. I mean, it was huge. And one of the first guys that I met in high school, because I moved right when my freshman year in high school started, was my buddy Mike. And shout out to Mike McKinney. He made me this fantastic mixtape. It had Obituary, Malevolent Creation, Morbid Angel, Immolation, Suffocation. It was just a plethora of bands. And I mean, to this day, I think I still have that tape somewhere in the garage, but that really opened everything up for me. And from then on, I started asking people, because now I'm in a bigger city. There's a scene of metalheads there at high school. So I'm picking everybody's brain, like, hey, this and that. And lo and behold, I find out there's a record store here in town called Hogwild Records. They focus on underground stuff and this and that. So there's an option there. I can go down there and check it out. And again, with people making me mixtapes, I started getting a bigger view of other bands and other different genres. I think the biggest impact, though, was one night I was up, studying for a test, and I turn on the regular college radio station, and Tony's on, and he's playing like even more underground metal. And again, I quickly grabbed a blank cassette tape, popped it in my boombox, hit record, and then figured, okay, I'll listen to this later and I'll write down the names of the bands and stuff. So that's pretty much how I got introduced to the deep world of metal and underground metal. and
Very
also
cool.
meeting DJs at the college station.
Yeah, yeah. I remember meeting Blind Tony when I first moved here back when I was like 18 and went to shows and like Deicide and things like that, where I saw Tony there and everyone knew Tony. But yeah, he is a very friendly guy, always had a big smile on his face. And yeah, I haven't really seen him much out anymore. He might I don't know if he's still in the metal or what, but yeah, I haven't really seen much of him. Cool. So now let's just do a general, everyone could jump in and kind of discuss and work off of each other. Just what metal means to us on a personal level. So anyone, they can chime in and, add their 2 cents now that we've established how we've all gone into extreme metal. So what metal means to me personally, like I said earlier, that I was obsessed with it. I just wanted heavier. Eventually I started realizing that the song structures were more important to me than the actual texture, the harsh textures and like feelings of the death metal and black metal, where I started really focusing on the how the songs are put together, how the riffs work together beyond sounding cool. And I would say about the age of 19 and 20, I started looking at music that way. Eventually I got into classical too, but I've always reverted back to metal. So I'm drawn to like the more powerful type of classical composers and things of that nature. And of course, like we can talk about how classical music has the sonata form. There's specific rules you have to obey, and metal does not have that whatsoever. But there's still, like in early Morbid Angel, Deicide, there are especially early incantation. There are like narrative structures to the songs where beyond just the riff sounding cool and just having this massive texture, they actually develop and go somewhere where like a band like Death, which Daniel will definitely disagree with me here, is more riff salad. They have a lot of awesome riffs, but the way the songs, especially later Death, is kind of just all over the place with
I'm with you on that 100%.
Yeah, Daniel's going to say otherwise. So what are your thoughts on that, Daniel? Like Death, for instance, like how would you compare the song structures of Death to like Morbid Angel, like early Morbid Angel?
Well, Morbid Angel has predictable changes as far as the patterns of the riffs. Everything would be standard. Play 4 riffs, maybe play 2, then play another 4. And Death will have a few more bridges and more riffs per song. So you'll see more permutations of a riff in their music.
But like on Symbolic and the Sound of Perseverance, it really sounds like the riffs are just kind of thrown together without like taking the whole song in consideration. I mean, that's my point of view. But to kind of go back to what metal means to me now, it's more about the narrative structure, because I've been listening to it since I was a little kid, and the harsh textures and the brutal catchy riffs or melodies, they don't speak to me as much as they did when I was younger. So now I kind of encompass the whole of the piece rather than focusing on riffs that sound cool. And kind of like, I know there are a lot of bands that are very knuckleheaded the way they approach songs. Like, yeah, that sounds fucking brutal. It's like, yeah, man, that fucking breakdown sounds brutal too. Very knuckleheaded approaches. But those songs, like the way the songs are put together, it doesn't really encompass the whole piece. It's more about the individual sections of sounding cool and stuff to bob your head to, but it may not be like the riffs may not be glued or stitched together in such a way where it communicates something more than sounding cool. So Gutted, I think Gutted is probably the best knuckleheaded band if you've heard them. They actually the riffs kind of flow pretty well, but you can tell they approached it from the cool sounding aspect of riff making but Gutted's probably one of the better ones. But yeah, I hear a lot of riffsality bands, and later death being one of them. So anyone is welcome to jump in on that.
I'd say that's definitely true of death metal, and it's one of the early appeals for me was sort of like piecing together the riffs and seeing how they'd structured the song around that rather than, you know, a pop format. But it did take a while for me to really kind of understand that, because it is still really dense. But I'd say on the black metal side, the textures and the atmospheres were very important for me as well. Like they do have a structure, albeit some often more basic than death metal, but it was the sort of melodrama of it and the sort of spacious, vast like atmospheres that these artists were trying to convey, which struck me as like unlike anything that I had heard before, and it became a very important sort of aspect of the sound. Like the first time I played Transylvanian Hunger, my mind was blown. I was like instantly within the world that album conveys, and it is a lot to do with the guitar tone or the shitty drum sound on that album. It all kind of culminates in just this sort of definition of obscurity, and I don't think that album would be the same with a slightly different sort of production or mix to it.
And I think you get extremes on both ends with death metal. You'll get technical death metal, which I describe as music for musicians to show off to each other. But then you'll have the other side of black metal, which is completely raw and very basic.
Yeah, and I would say like at the most extreme end of that would be an artist like Iljan, who took the I think he's got a few songs which are literally just one chord and it's always on a 4-track, and it's like I admire the audacity of it, but I understand that for some people it's probably a step too far for just being as basic and raw as you can possibly be.
I listened to a lot of Iljarn when I was doing college algebra. I don't know why, but just I guess the autistic nature of it made me appreciate numbers and stuff more. But sorry, it's a weird anecdote. But yeah, Iljarn is a great example of the extreme of black metal being raw and simplistic, and I would consider Dark Throne very simplistic. That's why there's so many Dark Throne clones out there, because the bar is so low. It's easy to emulate that, but they don't really capture the fire that Dark Throne had. So there may be 1,000 Dark Throne clones, but there's only one Dark Throne.
Well, yeah, that's why a lot of the imitators didn't really resonate with me. So for instance, like a Judas Iscariot, like I can appreciate it, but because it's lacking in, as you say, in that fire. And I think it does again come down to although the mixing on Judas Iscariot is shoddy as well, it's not shoddy in the right way. It doesn't sort of capture that otherworldly atmosphere that early Dark Throne did.
Yeah, Judas Iscariot, I had a hard time getting into that band. I know they're like a foundation for USBM, but yeah, the rest of the world still kind of views USBM as a joke. But I think I was talking with Jarno while I was in Finland last week about Dark Throne specifically. It might have been Jarno, where no, it was this lady Emma Tapper, an artist in Helsinki. The way I was having drinks and I had like an illuminating moment about Dark Throne, and with that, it's like, they started out as a death metal band, a really good death metal band at that, with Soulside Journey. They had actually done some gigs in Finland back then as a death metal band, but so the way I started summarizing like Dark Throne, so they actually had the technical ability way beyond what the black metal Dark Throne is. So I feel that because the musicianship that they were capable of was much higher than, Transylvanian Hunger and all that, they didn't approach the music like their emulators do. They just use the simplistic texture to convey a stronger message. Like, yes, they are capable of creating more complex and technically demanding, music, but what they ended up expressing was, stripped down, and it feels more honest because they were capable of much more. And it was really, I know in Norway, it was a movement to create this defining black metal sound. And I just feel that because they had the technical aspect in death metal, that they were able to dial it back and have a more honest expression, back then with the scene and the zeitgeist of black metal going around with Euronymous and his Helvete shop and all of that. Whereas you look at the Judas Iscariot guy, he probably would have a lot of difficulty even playing like basic death metal.
Yeah, I've had a similar thought to that before, and obviously a lot of the Norwegian bands, they all played in death metal bands before they switched over to black metal, like Thou Shalt Suffer and early Dark Throne and stuff like that, and Old Funeral as well, where guys in Burzum and Immortal were in that at different times. So there is an argument to be made for the fact that all of those foundational bands they were sort of self-limiting themselves, but in so doing they managed to sort of create a sort of black metal sound that's just sounded like it was played with much more conviction than bands that are kind of reaching beyond their technical ability. So yeah, there is an argument to be made for the fact that Dark Throne-ins kind of limiting themselves. It opened up new creative space for them to evolve.
Yeah. And so where the emulators fail in that aspect is because I'm not saying that a lot of the emulators are of low talents or anything like that. There's probably a lot of high talented musicians there. Like I know Daniel, he is a phenomenal guitarist. He actually created some black metal with a drum machine that I remember hearing back in the day. And it was actually really good. But I think, there was probably, that zeitgeist in forming a movement, true, like what is true black metal? There's always been hints, like even with death metal, back when death metal was codified or solidified, it was very ambiguous what death metal was. Is it like hyper, more abrasive thrash, or is it something else? So yeah, I just think there was like this, it was probably multifaceted in the aspect of why, you say a Dark Throne is way more better than other bands playing in the style of Dark Throne. So Jaime or Daniel, do you have any thoughts on that? Yay, nay?
Go ahead, Daniel. You go first.
Now, the only thing I could speak of when I'm considering death and black metal is just what I consider to be in song composition the best. Probably came out in the early 90s, and for me that would be around Incantation and Suffocation, Morbid Angel towards death metal, and for me it was Immortal, Emperor, and Satyricon. And I know they're considered mainstream, but the way they compose their music, like in Nemesis Divina or in the Nightside Eclipse, was on the same level on the death metal side as far as their song structures and compositions.
Yeah, on Nemesis Divina, I also kind of feel like it might be a little riff salady. So, I mean, I can understand like Immortal, yeah, very narrative structures, like, and very profound statements. It might be middlebrow, but very profound, like mountains of might, things of that nature, where it's like, wow, like, yeah, mountains are mighty. So, yeah. How about you, Brett? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you touched upon a lot of stuff that I agree with, which is the like when I first was listening to metal or death metal initially, a lot of it was like the brutality of it. And at the time, there was only so many different types of death metal back in the, let's say early 90s, mid 90s. And it all started branching out from there. And I found myself by the end of the 90s, early 2000, kind of bored with a lot of it. And I didn't stop listening to it, but I wasn't seeking it out anymore, because a lot of the stuff was rehash of what came before it. Now, with that being said, the musicianship got a lot better. The production got a lot better. So in that respect, and there was a lot more bands to choose from. So things evolved. They didn't just kind of sit there and stagnate, but I started to get a little bit bored with it, because there's only so many ways that you can play, a 4/4 riff and have a downbeat or do a thrash beat. There's only so many ways to do that. And I started needing more of the melodic. I always liked melody. Like I always wanted a little bit more melody in my music. And then like black metal at first, I was saying before, was a little bit sloppy, and it's almost by design, the recording and whatnot. But when In the Nightside Eclipse came out, and that blew me away, was the song structures, the composition. It wasn't just that the riffs, how good the riffs were, but like you were alluding to, which is the arrangement of it, where it flowed so naturally from one riff to the next riff. There was no herky jerky, like, oh, we're just going to stop here so we can put in a breakdown beat. It was just, it flowed so gracefully. And I really started looking for music that was more along those lines, where the riffs still needed to be heavy. It still needed to be brutal. It still needed to be, I guess, angry in some way. But I wanted the music to flow, and I wanted the riffs to flow naturally. And that's sort of how I write my own music now. I don't want to push myself in this conversation, but that's what I look for is definitely not just the riffs anymore. There's got to be strong structure and stuff like that, as you were alluding to before.
Hey, Brett, and to piggy off of what Brett said, I think in the night side, the keyboards, they were just so perfectly seasoned into the music where it wasn't overwhelming. Like, for example, and I know a lot of people might give me, a little bit of grief for this, but looking at like somebody like Dimmy Borger, where it's heavy on the keyboards. Nightside wasn't like that. They added it just the right amount to give it the right atmosphere and not overwhelm the listener with a bunch of keys. So to me, that was epic in it. And if anything, it's more profound in the Emperor self-release, that little EP that they had, the Night of the Graveless Souls. That is one of my favorite songs. And it's a shame that they didn't re-record it with a better production. But that song to me has it gives the tease of the keyboards, but as soon as you start getting into the keyboards, they kind of pull it back a little, so that way it doesn't just take over the conversation of the song. But again, that, in my point of view, I agree with you there, where in my mind, around 97, 98 was where I think a lot of black metal and death metal started kind of sounding really just generic cookie cutter. On the black metal side, I started seeing a lot of the bands that I was really into start going into a different, more Marilyn Manson-esque direction. The perfect example to me was, to me, Nemesis Divina is like the apex of Satyricon. To me, that was like, wow. I mean, their Shadow Throne is a great album. Dark Medieval Times is also really good. But after Nemesis Divina, it seems like Satyricon just said, you know what, let's just get popular and make as much money as we can, because realistically, can we really make a lot of money on this? No. So, we're not young anymore. We got to start, saving up. So here comes that, what was called Rebel Extravaganza or something like that. And I remember I was so excited about that album because all the hype and Metal Maniacs and all the metal magazines. And I remember I put it in the CD player, and within like 30 seconds, I was like, okay, this isn't going to work for me.
It's interesting that because earlier on I mentioned that I came to heavy music through new metal, and it does resonate the fact that the late 90s and early 2000s were a particularly dry patch as far as extreme metal is concerned, and older artists were either, as you said, like going for the bucks, or just repeating what they'd done before without really knowing how to evolve it. And it is interesting that at that time, such a sort of basic bastardization of heavy music that became new metal would become so popular. But then out of that began to evolve what I guess we could call like the old school death metal revival that started around 2010 onwards, with bands like Asphyx and Autopsy, releasing comeback albums and stuff that were actually like fairly decent, but again, just kind of reaffirming what had gone before, but introducing a new audience to it. Because when I was first getting into metal, it was all like it happened a decade before. It had all already come to pass, and I was just sort of picking up the pieces and putting it all together. There wasn't really anything like profound coming out at the time. And yeah, I guess I spent the rest of my time as a metal fan like looking for that moment. And there have been many great releases in the last 10 or 20 years, no doubt, but it's never seems quite the same as those formative years when it was all coming together for people.
Yeah, it never has that good first bite out of the apple taste, right?
Well, it's also an age thing, isn't it? I mean, I think probably is it Daniel? I think you're the biology teacher. Your brain as a teenager is different than your brain in your 20s, which is different than your brain at your 30s, 40s, and 50s. So it's very difficult you're not going to get that feeling that you got when you were 16, 17, 18, listening to, for me, it was listening to Hello Waits, or even in my 20s, listening to, In the Night Side Eclipse. You can't capture that. I mean, now I'm in my 50s, and you just can't, and it's kind of sucks.
Yeah, the happy chemicals that get released in the brain. But however, I will say I found very good experiences with the dopamine release or whatever when you're listening to good music for the first time, like in classical music, especially like Anton Bruckner, things like that. Discovering that later on, and like occasionally I'll hear something new, and it just blows my mind. And so, but it's outside of metal. So part of my musical growth is beyond metal. Maybe some metal adjacent stuff. But when I hear metal, it's very rarely that I get that same type of experience, especially when you're younger, when your brain is more impressionable or whatnot. Daniel can speak to more on this with how the neurotransmitters fire off more when you're younger, listening to music, or who knows. If you want to chime in, Mr. Daniel.
Well, I won't get into the biology aspect too much, but going back to the differences between like brutal death metal and the atmosphere of black metal, I think there was also a middle ground that evolved. And for me, that was like Dismembers, Indecent and Obscure. I remember hearing Dreaming in Red for the first time. And then you had Dissection, Storm of the Light's Bane. So both seem to have elements of death and black.
And Storms is a great album. What was your thoughts on the Somber Lane? I know it had more of an instrumental side to it, since the second guitarist, trying to remember his name, the one that left right after the first album, Johan. It's slipping me right now. But anyhow, I guess what I'm trying to get at is I felt like Somber Lane was a really good album, but it had a lot more of an atmosphere, more of the acoustic side, whereas Storm of the Light's Bane was like, let's see how awesome we can be and just record that.
I'd add to that Sacramentum, Far Away from the Sun, which to me kind of epitomizes that style, which kind of a lot of bands in Sweden who were doing that, they were combining the technical precision of death metal, but putting it towards a sort of black metal atmosphere and vibe. And yeah, it really worked for a time as well. But again, it sort of devolved into that sort of melodic death metal, mellow death kind of territory where it became kind of a simpler version of itself eventually. But
what was, just out of curiosity now, okay, not to take over and hijack the conversation here, but what was everybody's opinion on Dissection's Reign Chaos? Me personally, I didn't like the album. I mean, I know it was 10, 12 years from when the Storm of the Light's Bane album had come out, and John had been in jail for that time. But and it might be, again, going back to what Brett had mentioned about the older we get, the more we evolve with our taste in music. But to me, the first two Dissection albums, I mean, they can't be touched. Whereas Reign and Chaos, to me, was more like, I mean, it's Dissection in name, but in music, it's like, I don't know, it seemed like they took a big nosedive in the musicianship.
Well, I wouldn't say the musicianship. I mean, I think the musicianship is actually better on that album, but I view it much like I view Prometheus by Emperor. It feels like they're trying to go for something more lofty in the album, and I've seen true metalheads really, really enjoy that album. But for me, personally, it doesn't really connect. Kind of going back to what Shelley said of Sacramentum, and I think a great study, if he ever wants to do an article on it, if he hasn't already, is Sacramentum versus Dissection, and kind of piecing apart why, even though both are very melodic, one is more heavy metal oriented than the other. Like Sacramentum is more black metal, whereas Dissection is more traditional heavy metal.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, if you're going to be including Sacramento, you got to throw in Dawn from Sweden. I mean, come on, they're basically in the same category there. To me, it's a shame that Dawn didn't produce more albums after Slaughter Son.
Yeah, I would definitely throw Dawn in there and Vinterland. And I was just checking. I did do an article on Sacramentum a few years ago, but I compared them to, I don't know if I pronounce this right, Kvist from Norway, who, although they're a bit more lo-fi and raw, they did a similar kind of mix of death and black metal, but maybe a bit dirtier and more primitive than Sacramentum. But yeah, I did a compare and contrast between the two as well.
When hearing the words melodic death metal, I always have to put in Carcass's artwork and the jump they made from Symphonies of Sickness and Descanting the Insalubrious all the way up to Heartwork. They really went melodic.
Man, Heartwork, and it never, I don't know, for me, Carcass and Heartwork is just, I don't know, to me, I guess the previous album, Necromancy, was like, to me, the peak of Carcass. Heartwork, while more technical, to me, it just kind of lost its luster. I don't know. Maybe it's just me.
Again, being slightly younger, I got Heartwork first, and I remember I kept reading Carcass described as a grindcore band, and I was like, well, this isn't grindcore. This is sort of Arch Enemy stuff. And then I remember finally getting hold of Reek of Putrefaction. I was like, oh, that's what Carcass sound like.
I was so let down. I'm really picky, and Reek of Putrefaction, Symphonies of Sickness. I loved it when Heartwork came out. I was like, oh, come on. I was so let down by that album. I mean, maybe by itself, if it wasn't Carcass, if they gave it another name, I might have enjoyed it. But after those two albums, and I listened to Heartwork, I was like, I'm done with Carcass. And that was it. That was the last album I ever bought from that.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, Black Star, their offshoot band that they did after Heartwork, when the whole Carcass thing kind of crumbled. If Heartwork had fallen under the Black Star name, I would have been okay with it. And again, to me, I tried listening to, what was the one that came out like about 10 years ago? Was it Surgical Steel?
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah.
I could not get into that at all. To me, it sounded like these guys got back together. They realized, we might still be able to make some music, or at least some money, because, big money in tours. And I don't know, it just didn't, to me, it didn't meet the bar set by the previous Carcass albums.
Well, they were just trying to, that and the one they released very recently, Torn Arteries, they're just trying to redo the Heartwork magic. And as we've discussed, you can't repeat it, because although, not everyone likes that album, it really did resonate. But Carcass are an interesting case study in the evolution of death metal that we've been talking about, having started as really primitive grindcore all the way through to, full-blown death metal, and then into the more accessible melodic death metal, and then sort of finally falling flat with Swan Song. It's kind of an interesting case study in how death metal slowly declined over the mid-90s.
Then you see death metal and black metal kind of changing when Gorguts wrote Obscura, and then you had other bands like Deathspell Omega coming in.
Yeah, I always see Obscura as like an interesting watershed moment for death metal, where it was almost too heady for most people. So although you did have Deathspell Omega and quite a lot of modern, more technical bands who emulate the Obscura formula, I always imagine it kind of didn't quite resonate at the time. I could be wrong though.
But then you get into that whole technical, symphonic technical with all Flesh God Apocalypse and stuff like that, where the pinnacle, not necessarily the best musicianship anywhere, but getting into that upper echelon of the ability to play, still making it heavy, but almost relying too much on the symphonic aspect of it rather than of it. But again, going into the whole technical aspect of the musicianship going, and Heartwork was one of those albums actually early on where the musicianship was on another level, and now what you see with the musicianship and some of those bands are, like you were saying before, I think Jason, you were saying this, that the bands are writing music to show off their skills rather than to write good music.
I think Dauber Beverly, he was on this podcast and he summarized the technical, brutal, whatever death metal very well by saying it's more of visual music. Like you want to watch the musicians performing, crazy technical things than actually listening to it. But with Flesh God,
that's a great point.
With Flesh God Apocalypse, I just feel like it's all theatrics. Like this is carnival music. It's there to put on a show rather than convey any profundity or anything like that. But going back to Carcass, Necroticism was actually my first album that I got by them, like when I was like 12, 13. And I remember I had a Sega Dreamcast, and I would blast that playing the Sonic the Hedgehog game on the Dreamcast. So whenever someone mentions like Carcass, I think of Necroticism and then Sonic the Hedgehog. So there's that correlation there in my little Jason child self. So I actually do like Necroticism because of nostalgia, but it's not something I visit as an adult for like listening pleasure. I love symphonies, and especially the song "Genital Grinder." I've heard like
that's my favorite.
Yeah, I've heard like what the retro synth or whatever it's called, like the 80s synthwave stuff. And there's like a Genital Grinder version of that. It sounds fucking awesome. And it's all like a 80s electronic aesthetics, but it just works really well. So I might include that, I'll definitely today I'll include a song by Journey into Darkness and a song by Gored. And I might actually end it with that synthwave Genital Grinder for people if they're curious. But
I want to hear that. I don't remember it.
It's good. It was just some like random synthwave guy who made it. It was like a compilation of synthwave guys doing death metal songs. And
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, but that was the best one by far. It worked really well. So just I think before we wrap up today's episode, usually I try to keep episodes about an hour, and this is a very easygoing, casual conversation today. Nothing too grueling. Like I would like to end this episode on what metal means to each of us. I think I expounded a little bit about it, about the beyond the harsh textures of it nowadays, but I kind of look at how the structures are and how the riffs work together rather than the riffs viewed in isolation. For like the average Pantera fan, like they're really into just that brutal riff here and there or breakdown or whatever. I look at it more holistically and try to pick apart, like I try to give it some time and view how the riffs work together and what the song overall is conveying. So I'll start with Shelley, since he's the co-host and he survived drinking with me in England. What does metal mean to you? Like,
quite a lot of things, really. It can mean basic escapism, something to chill out to. I can, study it, as you were saying, in a more sort of formal way and talk about like the academia of how music is composed and what the artists are trying to convey. And yeah, it can be a deeply kind of emotional and resonant form of music. And I would also say it still, even to this day, has the ability to surprise me. I know earlier on we were talking about losing that magic, but certain albums and artists do still capture that for me. And that's the reasons why I enjoy writing about metal. And also away from the music, just culturally, it is still a very strong community within metal where the ratio of people that participate in it, if they're not musicians, they will be writers, journalists, gig promoters, and so on. And I really enjoy that high participation and the fact that it's international. You can go anywhere in the world, and if you find the right bar or the right group of people, you're friends straight away, and you can have chats like this. So yeah, it means a number of different things on a number of different levels to me.
Very cool. Definitely saw that in England, where you're more than welcoming for a strange guy from Texas, and so put the drinking to the test there. But how about you, Brett? You've been involved with extreme metal since pretty much its inception. What does metal mean to you, being such a veteran nowadays?
I think it's split, right? I mean, there's sort of like the regular metal. There's a few different metalhead communities, right? There's like the metalhead, meathead, I'm just, like you're saying, Pantera, get drunk and, that's it. And to other people, there's hair metal, which is more about glam and getting laid. And for me, it's always been much more on a cathartic release level. Like it's like it deep down in my being, it just moves me, and it's an outlet, and it lets me express my frustrations, but also my happiness. So it's able to kind of meld the two. So it really means it's the means to channel all that negative energy and actually make it positive. So that's sort of what it's been for me. And I think for a lot of people in the extreme metal, for either death or black metal, I mean, obviously they can be a little bit different, but I think it's that ability to take that negative aspect of the negative energy and actually twist it 180 degrees and make you feel better.
Yeah. I saw an interview Eric Rutan had done where he said, like, if he didn't become a metal musician, he would be in jail because he was a very angry individual, that metal was his outlet to channel that anger. So it could be a positive influence on people like that, or it could be escapism, like Shelley said. It could be a manifold of things. But what I think people are drawn into is that harsh and heavy texture initially, at least. Of course, there's always going to be the freaks out there who actually look at the composition first and it's like, oh yeah, then the texture is secondary. But yeah, very cool. How about you, Daniel? Like, what does metal mean to you personally? I know you started out in the Valley and went up to San Antonio. Now you're in New Braunfels, and you've carried that metal spirit from down south to up north of where I am currently. So what does metal mean to you personally?
Personally, it's about artistic freedom and not being bound to conventions, musical conventions.
So that's a very broad stroke. I mean, that could be like any type of art form, I guess. But
yeah, rather than being bound by scales, you could be chromatic. You could express yourself and express the darker parts, which I've only seen classical music get into.
I see. So there's also some pretty dark electronic music, even ambient music can be like Biosphere. Biosphere creates like this really, like, it makes you hate life listening to it sometimes. Like, it really like sheds the subjective aspect of reality from your being when you're listening to it. But yeah, Biosphere, definitely want to recommend that to you. Substrata is my favorite album by them, but it's not happy, pleasant music. It's textures that will make you like open your eyes and feel like the world doesn't really have much to offer. So I view that as very dark in that aspect. But yeah, I see where you're coming from, like more of a guitarist stance where there is a lot of freedom on the guitar for what you want to convey. You're not bound by classical structures. You're not bound by playing in certain keys, for instance, even though you may, like, when you create tabs, it might be in a certain key or whatnot. I have no idea. I'm not a guitarist, but there's all of that. So I kind of understand where you're coming from with that as a musician, where there is like unbridled freedom in the way that you can play the music. You're not bound by specific forms like in classical music, for instance. So
like in the university, I was in ensemble and private study for classical guitar, and I was bound by all their rules and structures. And in metal, I didn't have any of that.
Yeah, and you're a phenomenal guitarist, by the way. I remember when I was younger, like 18, 19, going to hang out with you, you'd bust out your guitar and start playing, and it was just mesmerizing. Just how talented you are, and you play it with so much ease too. That's what got me when I was younger. It's just how easy you made it look. It was like it didn't really feel like you were putting any effort to play very complex and technically demanding things. So definitely a phenomenal guitarist. How about you, Jaime? What does metal mean to you?
To me, as the other guys had mentioned, to me it is a bit of escapism. To be honest with you, I think metal is my mistress in the fact that when I moved from the Valley to San Antonio, I didn't know anybody, didn't have any friends or anything. So I relied on music. And to me, that was my escape. That was my focus. It helped me get my mind off of things for a good long time. It helped me focus on what I'm good at, especially, because as you had mentioned earlier at the beginning of the podcast about my collection, it got me to focus on, okay, what do I like? What do I focus on? And again, to me, the music, the atmosphere, it takes me to somewhere where I can be at peace and relaxed. No matter how chaotic the music is, in my mind, I am in complete zen.
That's interesting. So it's almost meditative for you, correct?
Yeah, in a way you could look at it. I mean, again, depending on the genre, it could be meditative. It could be just something that I need to cruise around, driving around just to, again, like you said, meditative, get my mind off of things for a little bit, escapism.
Very cool. Is there anything else, anyone wants to add to this conversation before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I got a question for Brett. You had mentioned that you are not a fan of Judas Priest, and I'm just curious, have you heard their Painkiller album? Because to me, it's like a blueprint for heavy metal. And then,
Yeah.
I mean, off of that to other genres.
Yeah, no, I have heard it. To be honest with you, I don't remember the last time I listened to it, but I've listened just peripherally to a lot of Judas Priest albums because some friends are all we're listening to it here and there. But yeah, I'm not going to say it's like bad music. It's not. Obviously, it's good, but I just don't enjoy it. I just there's something about just traditional heavy metal that I just don't really enjoy it. I don't know why, but it just is.
It's all cool, man. It's not your cup of tea. I get it.
Cool. So yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat too, where I got into extreme metal way too early, and I bypassed a lot of the foundational stuff like Judas Priest. I got into a little bit of Black Sabbath, but it was never like a big fan. But I appreciate what they did as a whole. And I did have a conversation with David Burke, the academic while I was in London, and I asked him, it was like, what is the first metal band? And initially I said, do you view Blue Cheer as metal? Because they had distortion, but they were before Black Sabbath. And he initially said yes, but then I saw his brain started working. And then he went to, it's like, no, Black Sabbath's really the first true metal band. So because he actually changed his thesis. Now he's focusing that metal is inherently based on loss rather than existentialism, which I can get behind that more than existentialism. But yeah, it was really interesting chatting with him and having his take on, Blue Cheer versus Black Sabbath. Have any of you guys heard Blue Cheer at all?
Yeah, I've heard them.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know any
so.
albums, but I've definitely heard them.
I mean, yeah, like you say, they have the texture of heavy metal, I guess, but they weren't doing anything like what Black Sabbath were doing, at least on like the title track of the debut, where
Right.
Blue Cheer still have that sort of party swing to them that was, fairly common for sort of heavy rock of the late 60s.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So I am going to wrap up this episode, and I want to thank you all for being on the program today. So we did have co-host Shelley from Hate Meditations, Disillusion magazine. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We do have Mr. Brett Claren coming back again from Journey into Darkness. He was also in Sorrow. I will be playing a song off his latest album, Infinite Universe, Infinite Death, when we wrap up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And I do have want to thank Mr. Daniel Valdez, great friend of mine since I was 18 and phenomenal guitarist. And Most of my favorite metal moments of discovering new things and sharing it with them is one of the happiest parts, of my existence. So I want to thank you for being on the program today, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we do have the metal Jaime. I must thank again for coming back. Thank you, Jaime.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate you having me back again.
Cheers, and thank you for listening.